Hello, I'm Mike Broadhurst and this is Old Man Saltbush, a plant that's indigenous to Australia. For thousands of years, Old Man Saltbush has been able to repropagate itself, to flourish and to grow in extremely harsh conditions. But it's been only in the last 100 years or so, despite poor management of this valuable resource and inept government policy geared towards land clearing, that we've seen natural stands of saltbush almost wiped from the Australian landscape. There's always been a hard core of landowners, farmers, who've understood the great value of Old Man Saltbush, but they haven't had the understanding for the re-establishment of the plant. Andrew Sipple from Narromine in central western New South Wales has a unique background which has enabled him to gather together the expertise and understanding which has allowed him to propagate and re-establish Old Man Saltbush. It's been largely Andrew's work which to date has reinvigorated the interest in Old Man Saltbush and raised its profile to where it stands today. Like Andrew, I've also had a deep interest in Old Man Saltbush, so I'm particularly pleased to be able to introduce you to 6 farmers from New South Wales and Victoria, all who have a different reason for planting Old Man Saltbush. All these farmers have gained tremendous benefits from Old Man Saltbush. They know it will ensure their property's long-term survival, both economically and ecologically. All the people you'll meet in this video have planted large areas to Old Man Saltbush and are continuing to do so. I think you'll find the next half hour very interesting, so sit back, relax, and listen to some remarkable comments, experiences and expectations from these 6 farmers. Old Man Saltbush, Atriplex numularia, indigenous to Australia, found in the drier areas of this continent. It was recognised as a significant plant back in 1890, when the then Department of Agriculture said of it,
"This is one of the plants whose value as a fodder plant would not be easy to exaggerate. Its advantages are that it's nutritious. It yields an enormous quantity of feed in a short time, it seeds enormously, and it may be readily propagated by cuttings. It has been so much appreciated that it's getting scarce. No one in Australia disputes its value, but it is desirable occasionally to remind our people of the worth of our native vegetation. If we are not careful, there are some native plants that we shall have to import from other countries."
That's where Old Man Saltbush stood back in 1890, and it seems that it's been almost ignored ever since. Today is different. The value of OMSB has once again been recognised.
In 1982-83, the country behind me looked like the Sahara Desert. With the saltbush plantation that you see in the distance behind me, that situation cannot reoccur.
The bottom line is that saltbush has enabled me to carry 5 times more stock than I would on my pasture paddocks.
I think the future, if I didn't have saltbush at the moment, I wouldn't have carrying a sheep, but I am at this particular stage, especially in this year. And I think my water table problems would, are really not a problem anymore, or a lot less a problem. I think I'd be floating around in the sea by now.
This plant has given us control of our feed supply. We know that on January the 1st next year that we can put in about 1,000 lambs into a paddock, and we know they'll be there for a month while we go on a holiday, and I think that gives us confidence to know that those stock are being fed while we're away.
Well, this would run nothing. You know, you might run 50 sheep for a week. And now we're running, the last year we ran 500 sheep with 300 sheep with 200 lambs for 5 weeks. And, you know, and it's going to do that for the next 100 years.
The hay PP board is in drought. It is in drought, all right. There's some very, very dry areas and some very, very bad areas. But if you could have saltbush in the magnitude that we've got it here on Oxy Station, there are ways round and through drought. And what we're showing here at Rungbox is an example of what can be done.
These men have one particular thing in common, apart from all of them being farmers and graziers. They believe fervently, even passionately, in the value of Old Man Saltbush. But, as you've already heard, each of them had a different reason to plant Old Man Saltbush in the first place. Have there been any other substantial benefits?
Well, the benefits are that you get a great deal of increased choice as far as your grazing program goes. Now, this year, for example, I've been able to run over 1,200 lambing ewes on Saltbush, get those lambs on the ground. We had an autumn break, gave us a bit of flush feed. I was able to take those sheep, give them a short burst onto the other feed, and then when it was no longer available, we took them back into the Saltbush again. Now, had I not had Old Man Saltbush, I'd have been locked into a very, very extensive and expensive hand feeding program, and we would now have been into at least our 4th month of hand feeding and well and truly behind the 8 ball. With the Saltbush, the only feeding that I've done to date has been an odd round bale to the ewes in the latter half of the grazing of the bush, and we've just started the lambs that have been weaned off the ewes on self-feeders to try and get them topped up for fats later in this spring. If I hadn't gone ahead and planted Old Man Saltbush, we would have been running exactly the same program as we were 10 years ago, which was heavily reliant on hand feeding in almost every year. Now, that is utter craziness. If you can get management that won't rely on a very high volume of hand feeding, you've got to be streets in front.
In 1987, when I first planted my 14 acres, my main reason for putting it in was to break droughts. But since I've put in my 75 acres, and now that I'm putting my 400 in, it is an important role in everyday management of the farm, just not drought management. It gives me flexibility as I can crop. My cropping program and my stock program working together. With the 400 acres of saltbush that I plan, that still leaves me approximately 4,000 acres that I can farm with and work the cropping program with the stock more easily.
When I first put the plants in, I had no idea of the potential and exactly what the plant had to offer. I find it's an amazing plant, really. Very rarely lets you down, if ever. I think the benefits of the saltbush are a reduction in water table dramatically, which enables all the native species to come back into the soil, and has enabled me to increase the sheep population. And in a year like this, it's been a fantastic benefit in having continual feed, where there's no feed anywhere else, basically. Originally, the first paddock of saltbush I put in was 120 acres, and after the 12-month period, we put about 4,000 sheep in there for a period of 9 weeks, and before that there were 1,000 ewes and lambs, which was equivalent of about 7 sheep per acre on a year-round basis. And before we put the saltbush in, it would only run a maximum of, say, 1.5 sheep. And this grazing we've done the second grazing, and that was similar figures, which is some 5 or 6 times greater production of what it was as bare grassland country.
We're getting more production out of the saltbush than we were off the areas that we planted down. Before we put the saltbush in, on one particular paddock of 35 acres, we were lucky to get a week's feed off it for about 300 sheep. But now we're getting 4 sheep to the acre grazing out of it on an annual basis. The main reason we put it in was we had a problem on this place with a feed gap in the summertime. Up until Christmas we normally get a good fill of feed, but after then, when it dries out, there's virtually nothing, especially when the stubbles are gone. You've got to keep going then until the autumn break. We normally cut hay up until we decided to go in for planting saltbush, and we don't cut any hay at all now. and we're saving ourselves that cost, and we're saving ourselves the time of feeding it out.
Well, we planted old man saltbush because we're having a dry land salting problem, and we'd planted wheatgrass and puxinella, and that wasn't quite good enough. And we'd seen Bob McFarlane's article in the Weekly Times once, and we went up there and had a look at him planting it, and we went from there. It is improving our salt slowly. It'll be 10 years before we really, I'd say, 10 years before we really know whether it will lower the salt areas, but it's doing well.
We've never ever had to feed our livestock of any sort, whether it be sheep or cattle, any sort of supplement feeding. Not saying I didn't try, because I got influenced a bit by salesmen and that to have a go, but I've never been forced into the issue. And the only time I have given any sort of hand feeding out is around our wool shed, which I hope we will develop with saltbush, but that's in an intensive area where we haven't got a lot of growth because of the worry of fire, and we have eaten it out to the risk of burning our wool shed. But that is the only time I've ever contemplated hand feeding. And as you've seen the ewes and sheep today, in an area the Hay PP board has declared drought, my sheep are far from drought stricken. I've always had that feeling of security. I've always felt terribly sorry for when I go to visit people and hear how much time they're spending on hand feeding or buying in feed. I heard the other day a bloke spending $263 a tonne to buy corn in to feed his livestock. I'm very glad to come home and look to see what I've got. I'm very proud of home at Oxley Station, because I do believe it will be environmentally, ecologically and economically one of the most sustainable properties in Australia.
Old Man Saltbush must be planted out as seedlings because the fertility of the seed is very low, at about 25 to 30%. Although seed production in the natural state is prolific, natural regeneration only amounts to 2 to 3%. But, once established, the plant is extremely hardy. As Bob McFarlane from Oxley Station explains, some saltbush plants that have been broken but still have an attachment to the parent plant will regenerate and spread.
Where it's broken off here, Andy, you can see that it's regenerated and refixed itself and still growing. Whereas most trees that break a branch, whether it be a peach tree or a gum tree, you have to cut away. This plant has that wonderful ability of mending and putting itself back into action.
At Narromine, in central western New South Wales, Old Man Saltbush is carefully and extensively propagated. Old Man Saltbush seedlings are grown in a sterile environment to eliminate the possibility of transferring soil-borne diseases to the paddock. Only the strongest plants are allowed to grow to planting out stage to ensure the best chance of establishment in the paddock. Staff regularly thin the weaklings. Plants need to be cultivated in this controlled nursery environment for at least 6 months, at which stage they should have achieved strong woody growth. This will ensure the highest possible survival rate when transplanted to the field. In this specially controlled environment, where the air temperature, nutrition levels, moisture levels and plant management is closely monitored, the highest possible germination and survival rate can be assured. After 6 months, the specially selected seedlings used for final transplanting are transferred outside to allow them to harden and develop budwood prior to field planting. Correct ground preparation is crucial to the establishment and survival of the young saltbush. Grazing management systems will provide full agronomic and management support, beginning with site selection, planting out, assisting in management and the survival of the plant, and finally, achieving optimum grazing from the bush. The transplanting is carried out by a machine specially designed for the job. 2 people can work at one time in a comfortable and easy-to-use system, and as long as certain simple procedures are followed, there should be no problems in assuring successful transplanting. The saltbush transplanter is fast and easy to use and can handle up to 20,000 bushes over an 8-hour day, given good conditions. The rubber-tyred vehicle allows the planter to work in all soil types, the tyres assisting in ensuring the soil is firmly pressed around the young seedling. The tank on the rear of the planter injects a given amount of water at the base of the plant to ensure a good start to its life in the paddock. Grazing management system staff will deliver and set up the transplanting equipment and supervise the operation to ensure as good a result as possible. Only the strongest plants are allowed to survive in the initial seedling stage, so when transplanting is carried out correctly, the result should be at least a 90% establishment rate or better. Our business philosophy does not allow us to take shortcuts. The plant is long-lived, so everything possible must be done to make sure successful establishment is achieved. A poor establishment is an expensive mistake for a long time. On recent studies, there's certainly not a great deal of difference nutritionally in the match-up between Old Man Saltbush and the so-called king of fodders, lucerne. Crude protein, 21.5% for OMSB and 21.8% for lucerne. Metabolised energy, 11.1% OMSB, 10.6% lucerne. ADF, 24.8 Saltbush, 27.9 lucerne. Dry matter, Saltbush 28.8, lucerne 22.4. And finally, digestible dry matter 73.5% for Saltbush and 71% for lucerne. So what is the difference between Old Man Saltbush and lucerne when it comes down to it? There is no doubt that Saltbush has a longer life than lucerne. Saltbush doesn't need renovation, fertiliser, cultivation or spraying for pests, and the biggest plus of all is that Saltbush, once established, can survive in far more hostile environments than can lucerne, without much looking after, and it's far more salt tolerant than is lucerne. But what about returns per hectare for various given enterprises? There are various assumptions made in this graphic, and you'll have to adapt your local figures to those given. But the upshot is that the net return is $103 per hectare. Again, in this graphic, you'll have to adapt your local figures, but the net return shown here for wethers on dryland pasture is just $46 per hectare. Of course, the assumption made here is that there is sufficient dryland pasture to feed the stock. Estimating conservatively the return for wethers on Old Man Saltbush with the stocking rate allowed and making no allowance for a cleaner, higher value fleece, the net return speaks for itself at $229 per hectare. So what needs to be thought about is how much Old Man Saltbush is going to do the job for you in your situation, and then how long will it be before that outlay is returned?
I would say your payback period is roughly 4 to 5 years. I wouldn't care if it took 10 years to get that money back that's been spent, because once that payback period is gone, then you don't have to do the job again. That's the bit that I like.
At $300 an acre, I would anticipate with a wool micron indicator at 700 cents, we'd probably be looking at 4 to 5 years before we'd get our money back. That doesn't actually take into account some of the other benefits, i.e. being able to opportunity sell grain, hay, being able to value add to your lambs when you wouldn't previously have been able to do that. It doesn't take into account the fact that your other pasture, and this I must say is one of the main things that I've noticed, your other pasture is in better health because you haven't had to beat the living daylights out of it.
The cost of establishment is about $250 an acre, which includes everything, planting and fencing and water. And the payback period is 5 to 6 years based on wool program which I first started. But now that I'm in cattle and the buying and selling program, I can outdo what I was doing with the sheep, probably twofold.
The return on the first paddock of saltbush that I put in was about $140 an acre return with the type of wool that I have, fine wool. So therefore, it really for the second year's grazing, it only owes me about $60, which was cut out easily with the second year's grazing. So I'm well ahead after 2 years.
Well, I did a bit of calculation one day, and I think on our place we run about 2,000 ewes when the seasons are good, and I thought if we could get up to about 400 acres, that would be completely paying for itself year by year. and putting in 50 acres, 60 acres a year, each year it'd pay for itself for the extra stock.
As Robert Mears explains, there are other benefits of running sheep on Old Man Saltbush.
I think as far as worm control with sheep, I think with seeing the sheep are eating off the ground, eating from the bush and not the ground, and you're also putting the sheep into a fresh paddock maybe once a year or twice a year, it's a great reduction in the parasite control, without a doubt.
Lloyd Naylor agrees.
With the worm levels in the sheep, it's nice to know that as the level of feed supply drops off in the paddock, the sheep start to graze at a higher level, and even though they may be getting near eaten out, they're not susceptible to picking up worm eggs or larvae, because the droppings go straight on the ground and they don't climb up the plant. There are other management benefits. I think the main one is that we can keep our stock on this place, because normally after Christmas or after the stubbles were eaten out, we'd have to put them on the road and shift them out onto an irrigation block that we've got. That saved us that time. That's time we can spend on doing other things.
The resting of the other paddocks is probably one of the most important things, because it enables the pasture paddocks to freshen up. And the one thing that I have noticed is the increased stocking on the country that I do spell with the saltbush.
I think the fleeces are on saltbush are a cleaner fleece. There's basically no vegetable matter at all, and very little dust, providing you get your watering spots right over the summer.
Yeah, this year I'm holding, if you take a glance at her staple length there, you've got to realise that an animal that's not been given adequate nutrition cannot produce a staple like that. Now these ewes, they've been on saltbush continuously for months now, and seeing that excellent staple development there tells me that it's doing a pretty good job. Well, what having saltbush here has allowed me to do is opportunity sell hay and grain when I would previously have had to retain it in case the drought kept going, and that's a very, very great privilege, an advantage.
The benefits of having more saltbush than your neighbours is purely being borne out in a year like we're having in 1994, where people are having to send cattle away on agistment. I'm actually taking cattle on agistment. The cattle from my neighbour, not from 100 miles away, but my neighbour is actually putting cattle on agistment for me because he hasn't got any saltbush.
Well, it's a long-term investment. That's the thing. You spend the money now and you've got it for the rest of your life and the rest of the farm's life. And I think that is the main thing with it. It's the long term of the saltbush.
The struggle to keep going when times get tough often overcomes farmers and graziers to the point where they're forced from the land. The question needs to be asked, is that necessary when there is an alternative? What we're saying is that Old Man Saltbush provides an alternative. And hearing what these farmers and graziers say about the future of their properties with OMSB must be worth remembering.
Well, I look at the 1,000-acre strategy from the point of view that it's going to give me another 3,000 DSE units here. I plan to have all that saltbush expense paid for after 5 years at the completion of the planting. That should allow me to make, even on present-day market, an additional $45,000 net income on this property. And that's a pretty handy increase to the levels that I've been achieving in the past.
The Oxley Station without saltbush on today's economic strategies would just be a non-event. Mainly due to the size of it, 25,000 acres or 10,500 hectares is just not big enough in this area without some plant like Old Man Saltbush. Old Man Saltbush has the ability to intensively graze and recover far greater than any other plant that I know. And in this rangeland environment, that's terribly important.
My current situation at the moment with saltbush is I have 90 acres on the total property size of 4,500 acres, and I plan to increase to 400 acres of saltbush, which is roughly about 10%. With that 400 acres planted, I expect my net income will get up to at least 60 or 70% more than what it is at the moment. That's on a pretty conservative program.
Yeah, with the establishment costs, it's a one-off cost, and once the plants are in the ground, there's no further attention needed, and you can plan for a long time in advance. We can look down the road 25 years and know that those plants are still going to be there.
I think the return of a place like this, but just with wool production, is going to be substantially lifted, or will be substantially lifted, and is, just through having guaranteed feed all the year round. And it's going to lift the carrying capacity of this place by probably 40%, I'd say, and a guaranteed 40%, because the plant just keeps growing. It doesn't have to rely on rainfall with the deep root system it has.
There is no doubt that Atriplex numularia, Old Man Saltbush, has the capacity to ensure that you have a sustainable source of highly nutritious feed all year, every year. This will then overcome the heavy reliance you've traditionally placed on the seasons. If you have sufficient well-established Old Man Saltbush on your property, it has been amply demonstrated that the traditional feed gap between seasons and in dry spells is no longer a problem, or even a factor in total farm management. So, Old Man Saltbush not only gives you total confidence that you'll be able to feed your stock from one period to another, it also guarantees that your property will be an ecologically improved asset and substantially drought-proof. The farmers who've appeared in this video have done so because they have the results from OMSB which cannot be refuted. All these farmers also have one other aspect in common. They've all had the long-term assistance and experience of Andrew Sipple of Grazing Management Systems at Narromine in central western New South Wales. With GMS's established techniques, these farmers, just a few amongst many, who have proven there is no risk when you invest in Old Man Saltbush. If Grazing Management Systems advice is followed correctly and establishment is not successful, then GMS will simply supply replacement plants at no charge. If you think OMSB has a place on your property, there's no time like the present. Give Grazing Management Systems a call and arrange a property visit. It could be the most valuable telephone call you ever make.